from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims.
During the summer of 1945, near the end of World War II, representatives of 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to form the United Nations. Their charter was ratified October 24th. In February of 1946, the United Nations General Assembly decided that the headquarters of the organization would be in the United States. New York City was later chosen as the site. The building housing the headquarters sits on land owned by the UN and is international territory. Since the time of the Charter's ratification, the United Nations has grown to 159 member states. The largest member is China. The United Nations is also made up of 6 of what it calls major organs, 16 agencies, and many affiliated programs. Here are the 6 major organs of the UN. The General Assembly is often referred to as the town meeting of the world. It's the main deliberative body of the UN and is composed of all member states. The 3-month session of the General Assembly begins on the 3rd Tuesday in September. During the Assembly's debate, many heads of state will address the group on issues and concerns of their state. The General Assembly does not have the power to compel an action by a government. However, it can make recommendations. One of the many programs established by the General Assembly is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. The Security Council has as its primary goal maintaining security around the world, including sending peacekeeping operations to member states. Debate on the Council includes security questions of member nations. In January of 1989, members discussed the downing of a Libyan fighter by American planes.
We fully understand and approve of the reasons which prompted the Libyan government to ask for the convening of the Security Council and to voice its legitimate complaint. The use of force by the United States is unacceptable and represents a serious threat to the security and stability of a sovereign state, an act that is in violation of international law.
Routine operations over international waters well beyond the 12-mile limit of the territorial sea claimed by the government of Libya were aggressively and hostilely challenged by the Libyan Air Force. The recordings of the pilots' conversations, which were published over television, and which I will not repeat here, make it all the more clear that we acted in self-defense. It does not enhance the cause of world peace or the role of the Council to pretend that the facts are other than what they are.
The Council is the only organ of the UN whose decisions command compliance by all members. Any one permanent member, however, can veto a proposal. The 5 permanent members on the Council are China, France, the USSR, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The other 10 members are elected for 2-year terms. The third organ of the United Nations is the Secretariat. It overlooks the day-to-day operation of the UN at the headquarters and in the field by administering its programs and policies. The Secretary General, who's appointed by the General Assembly, is the head of the Secretariat. One of the many functions of the Secretary General is the power to bring any matter to the Security Council, which he feels threatens international peace and security. The fourth organ of the United Nations is the Economic and Social Council. It's under the authority of the General Assembly. The Council coordinates the economic and social work of the UN and the specialized agencies. The Trusteeship Council is assigned to supervise the administration of trust territories, which are territories under the jurisdiction of another nation. One of the goals of this council is to assist these territories to become self-governing. The International Court of Justice is located in The Hague and is the only organ of the UN not located in New York City. Being the principal judicial body of the UN, the court can give advisory opinions on legal questions posed to the UN. Also, legal disputes can be referred to the court by the Security Council. The person who represents the United States at the United Nations is Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who took over the position in March of 1989.
Well, this is a world of great changes. It's a time when all of these changes will be having an influence around the globe. There's probably no more interesting place to watch this, no more sensitive place perhaps to perceive how and in what way it is going than the United Nations.
Coming up next, we continue our look at events in the Persian Gulf region with an interview with Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. She will continue our discussion of the role of the United Nations in Persian Gulf region events, and she'll offer her perspective as a former U.S. representative to the UN during the Reagan administration.
Dr. Kirkpatrick, I'd like to start my discussion with you on the United Nations itself. Could you have foreseen a series of events like the decisions made just recently by the United Nations?
Well, I could have foreseen them now, but I couldn't have foreseen them 2 years ago. But because what they reflect is not only the world's outrage and disapproval of Saddam Hussein's aggression, but they reflect the end of the Cold War and the Soviets' willingness to join in consensus with other nations in defining aggression in conventional ways. You know, it couldn't have happened until the Soviet Union was ready to adopt conventional conception of aggression.
In the most recent decision, it seemed as though there was a little bit of foot dragging on behalf of the Soviet Union. What was going on behind the scenes, do you suspect?
Well, I think that there's several things one has to bear in mind. One is that the Soviet Union has been a treaty ally of Iraq's for decades. Iraq has one of those treaties of friendship with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has been its principal supplier of arms. And it has all these 8,000 trainers in Iraq, and that's a relationship that's very long-standing. So I'm sure that there's a certain kind of pressure and pull just of that historic alliance with Iraq, and a reluctance to position themselves in a way that would create real problems for Iraq. Second, I think it is true that that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze have said they were not going to use force in international affairs now in this period of great reform in the Soviet Union itself. And so I think that those two factors combined left the Soviet Union in a kind of foot-dragging mode on a UN a Security Council authorization of the use of force to enforce the embargo. But of course the Soviet Union came around on it. And I'm not surprised either by that, because I think that the new, reformed Soviet government is really quite interested in playing a constructive role in the UN and elsewhere.
Did the Bush administration do the right thing at the right times with regard to the United Nations and its seeking of approval from the UN?
Oh, I think the Bush administration and its UN team have just been extremely skillful and effective, and I give them very high marks, kudos, for their performance in the UN. I think, first of all, they were right in going to the UN immediately after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and they immediately went to the Security Council and sought action and condemnation of Kuwait's incorporation into Iraq. And there were, of course, a series of resolutions, beginning with the outright condemnation of the Iraqis for an act of aggression. That's very important. That language is very important in the UN, because an act of aggression is a threat to international peace and security, and it creates the situation in which the UN may adopt, the Security Council may then adopt sanctions. And so they first sought UN condemnation of an act of aggression, and they got that characterization of the invasion as an act of aggression. Second, they sought the UN support for sanctions. And third, now they've got UN support. Well, and a UN resolution, Security Council resolution, declaring null and void the incorporation of Kuwait by Iraq. And now the support for the use of minimal force in enforcing it. Each time it's been necessary to do some UN politicking. Everything requires some UN politicking. And they've done it very effectively, and I think they really deserve very, very, very high marks for this performance.
That U.S. team is led by Thomas Pickering. What can you tell us of him?
Well, he's a career diplomat. I first met him when he was appointed by Ronald Reagan to be our ambassador in El Salvador. And actually, I was not at all enthusiastic about his appointment when it was initially announced, because he had no previous experience in Central America, and it was a very tense, tight situation in El Salvador at that time. And I was very interested in that area, followed it very closely, and I very quickly came to see that Tom Pickering was doing a first-class job in El Salvador. He was a quick study, let's say that. And he came to know both the country, the people, the problems very quickly, and I think did a fine job. I then observed his performance in Israel. He went from El Salvador to Israel as the U.S. ambassador in Israel, where again I think he performed in a highly creditable fashion and demonstrated his capacity to work in very different environments. And I guess the Vice President, then Vice President Bush, was also impressed by him in the same context I was and appointed him. He was, I think, one of his very first appointments was as U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And I naturally have been interested in his performance there, and I just think he's done exceedingly well.
How does the President's own diplomatic experience play into his handling of the situation?
Well, first of all, I think that the President, after all, was the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, too. U.S. Permanent Representative, I should say. That's the top ambassador we have there. And so he knows a lot about the way the UN works and can work, and he also knows what it's good for. You know, it's been said about the United Nations that its principal function is collective legitimization and delegitimization. UN really can't, can't make war, and it can't impose peace, but it can legitimize and delegitimize actions by providing an arena in which the countries of the world can express their views. And that collective delegitimization of an act can be really quite important and disabling to the country who's being delegitimized. And in this case, it was Saddam Hussein. And I think that the fact that President Bush understands what the UN can do encouraged him to move immediately into the UN to seek this delegitimization of Saddam Hussein's seizure of Kuwait. And I also think that it makes him just much more skillful in coalition building. I think they've done a really first-class, very impressive job in securing, not so much securing or mobilizing as sort of harnessing and integrating support from Arab countries, including the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, of course, and Egypt and Morocco and the other nations in the Arab region. And I have no doubt that the President's on-site, hands-on diplomatic experience, international experience, has enhanced his abilities in this kind of coalition and consensus building. I think, we've done reasonably well with the NATO nations. Certainly, it was Turkey. It was a very good thing that Turkey was willing to join us and send troops, and the President himself has worked closely with Mrs. Thatcher. His personal relationships with some of the heads of states has helped. The Europeans still haven't done as much as I think they should, quite frankly. But I think that the President's international experience just gives him a surer sense of how to proceed, even technically, in these situations.
Also this week we will likely see some personal involvement by Perez de Cuellar in his role of trying to find a moderating solution. He will be traveling to the Middle East. Is this appropriate role for the person who heads the United Nations? And also, what can you tell us of this man individually?
Well, I worked very closely with President Kuwait on a number of issues, so I feel, as with the President, I feel I know him pretty well, in fact, and have a sense of the man. And he's a consummate diplomat, Latin American, who's served in all of the principal capitals of the Western world and some of the non-West too. I think it's probably significant that he's been elected. He was chosen as Secretary General and has served largely in a time of Cold War. He's most accustomed to a UN dominated by divisions, polarization. I'm not quite sure what I think that means, but I think it's important. He is cautious, deeply committed to peaceful resolution of problems, not in anybody's pocket. He's no special friend of anybody. He has, on the other hand, some fairly strong Latin American identifications, and I would even say third world identifications. Which sort of interesting in this context because he's also worked very closely with Tariq Aziz, who's the Iraqi foreign minister, in the negotiations on the Iran-Iraq war.
And that's the specific person he'll be talking with this week.
That's the specific person he's going to Baghdad, or from Baghdad anyway, that he will be talking to this week. Are they going to meet in Baghdad?
I believe Jordan.
Jordan, that's what I thought. It's outside Baghdad. But in any case, it will be, yes, a man with whom he has dealt a good deal in the past. He has, of course, also dealt a good deal with George Bush in the past. But he's going now to declare null and void the incorporation of Kuwait by Iraq, and which has not only declared sanctions and an embargo, but has authorized the use of force against Iraq. So it isn't as though he's free, no matter what his personal feelings may be, he's not free to treat this as just, two parties with different views of a problem. The Security Council of the United Nations has clearly branded Iraq an aggressor. I think it would have to be the case that Javier Pérez de Cuellar would have to see his job as not only trying to bring about a kind of détente in the current crisis, but in persuading Iraq to implement the resolutions of the Security Council. The Secretary General of the United Nations is the agent of the Security Council. And he's not free to try to change policies adopted by the Security Council. So he's going into these conversations with very clear instructions, you might say, from his Security Council about what the situation is. It's very interesting to me that none of the resolutions in the Security Council mandates the Secretary General to seek some sort of resolution of this problem. That's particularly interesting because in the past, most resolutions of the Security Council which involve disputes among nations, do call on the Secretary General to use his good offices to try to seek a resolution of the dispute. These resolutions don't do that. I don't know why they don't do it, but they don't.
So he's choosing to involve himself.
So he's taking on his own initiative. He's involving himself on his own initiative. And that's rather rare for a Secretary General, too. So that makes it all especially interesting.
You mentioned that the United Nations, specifically Pérez de Cuellar, was involved in negotiating during the Iran-Iraq war. Iraq comes to the table feeling how about the United Nations in general, other than this time period? What kind of a history had it had with the United Nations in getting what it wanted, or?
Well, Iraq. First of all, Iraqi diplomats are often quite skillful. Iraq has a strong foreign service and a tradition of competent diplomats, and they have had some very competent diplomats at the United Nations. One of their diplomats, Ismet Ketani, was president of the General Assembly and has served in various roles in the Security Council. And there have been some, I don't mean the Security Council, I mean the Secretariat, excuse me. There have been quite a lot of ties between Iraq and the Secretariat of this United Nations. Iraq, you know, was the much easier country to deal with during the Iran-Iraq War, I think for at least two reasons. One is that the Iranians were just very unreasonable much of the time, and frequently were not speaking to almost anybody else in the United Nations. And frequently the Iranian ambassador was not on, the Iranian government were not on speaking terms with most of the members of the Security Council. The Iraqis, who were in a very bad bind militarily in much of the Iran-Iraq War, were on the other hand very active in the UN and the Security Council and cooperative in trying to seek a ceasefire and so forth. They wanted a ceasefire for no other reason than they needed a ceasefire. And they found a lot of support for their position among the countries and through the Security Council and around it. So they come to the UN with a strong position historically, and a good many personal ties and a good sort of national experience through the Iran-Iraq War. And it must be a big shock to them that these resolutions have been passed which unanimously, or nearly unanimously, condemn Iran.
A conversation with Jeane Kirkpatrick at this time period. We're not going to be taking your telephone calls, so folks who are dialing in probably makes sense to abandon those phone calls at this point, and we'll continue with our conversation here. Let me tell you a little bit about Ambassador Kirkpatrick. She's currently serving as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and also teaching at Georgetown University.
I'm a professor at Georgetown.
Professor at Georgetown. In what subject areas?
Government. I'm a professor of government at Georgetown.
What level of students are you taking on? Graduate mostly?
I take senior majors in government and international affairs and graduate students.
You're also writing columns. I see you in the paper. Is that a regular?
Yes,
feed?
it's a regular. I write a weekly column which is syndicated by the Los Angeles Times and which appears in quite a lot of newspapers.
What kinds of topics have you chosen about the Middle East since this situation for your column?
I've been on vacation. August is the month I almost always take off from my column. But I have just last week written a column on the war that's, and what I thought had happened and should happen.
And what should happen? What are you saying?
Well, I think that I'm very supportive, in fact, of the administration's policies now. At this stage, I think that we should continue the sort of squeeze and contain. That's a blockade, strong blockade, close all the leaks in the blockade. I think it's very important for the administration to achieve its goals now, its stated goals, including the restoration of an independent Kuwait and the restoration of the Kuwaiti government. I also think that it's important not to leave Saddam Hussein with the kind of war-making capacity that he's had until now. We've got to find a way to discourage his use of force and threats of force in the in the future against all of his neighbors, virtually all of his neighbors. He's either committed aggression or threatened aggression against virtually all his neighbors.
Critics of the situation will say that it is the West that gave him the power to be an aggressor in the area. Did earlier policies, in fact, contribute to the Saddam Hussein that exists today?
Well, I think that, frankly, there's a certain amount of exaggeration. There's a certain amount of truth and a certain amount of exaggeration in that characterization. Actually, Saddam Hussein's principal sponsor militarily has been the Soviet Union. I mentioned that they had signed a friendship treaty decades ago, and that the Soviets have provided Iraq with very substantial material and training. Those 8,000 Soviets that are in Iraq right now, teaching them to use the weapons and helping them use the weapons which the Soviets have supplied, are symbolized that the presence of really large-scale Soviet assistance. So, it's simply not true to say that Saddam Hussein is who he is because of Western support. It is true that Western nations have given a lot of help to Saddam Hussein, however. The French have sold a lot of arms to Iraq. They've been probably the principal Western arms suppliers and have given a lot of those, sold a lot of those on credit, moreover, when subsidized and with credit. The Germans have provided a good deal of credit, and also, unfortunately, a substantial part of the chemical weapons. So some of the European countries sold those components of chemical weapons. Italy has, for example. I think the Netherlands did for a period. And the United States tilted toward Iraq during a period during the Iran-Iraq War. This all happened during the Iran-Iraq War, by the way, when everyone was worried virtually in the West about the possible victories of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And when the Iranian armies began to advance into Iraq and to press at the perimeters of Iraq, the concern about a victory by the Ayatollah Khomeini and his forces caused a lot of a good deal of Western support for Iraq.
Were you one of those people that supported Iraq at the time? Or tilted towards Iraq and having to choose sides?
What we did in the United Nations, actually, we didn't talk about it. But I think there wasn't very much you could do where I was, but insofar as there was something we could do, we joined the British and the French and the Dutch and other Western members of the Security Council, including the Soviets from time to time, in not taking actions which were damaging to Iraq, including, I regret to say, that the failure to condemn by Iraq the use of chemical weapons.
When you had an opportunity to advise the president at the time with regard to it, what kind of advice did you give him with regard to Iraq?
I don't know that I ever gave the president any advice whatsoever.
Has the use of chemical weapons been substantiated? That's a given fact, because the Iraqis have flip-flopped from time to time in their statements on that.
No, I regret to say that it's a fact. The Iraqis, there's just really no question that the Iraqis used chemical weapons against the Kurds, the Iraqi government did, and in their own country, and they used chemical weapons against the Iranians. I think the Iranians also used chemical weapons against Iraq. I'm not much mistaken.
With regards to justifying his move, President Saddam Hussein is suggesting he has a legitimate stake on the territory of Kuwait. Right. Where does that claim come from?
I think that's just for the birds, if I may say so. I really, some silly birds too. It is a fact that, I mean, Iraq did not always exist in its historical borders. It didn't always exist, period. And Kuwait didn't, and no country in the Middle East did. Their boundaries are an artifact of colonialism in part, as well as an artifact of their own ethnic sort of lines. And they were drawn as much by the colonial powers as they were drawn by anyone else. That's true of all the countries in the Middle East, basically. It's also true of the countries in Africa and most of the countries in Asia, a lot of the countries in Asia. It's true of a lot of the European countries, too, that their boundaries have been drawn as a consequence of wars, now and then. And I mean, what makes it absurd is that Kuwait was universally recognized as a sovereign country, which was membership in the United Nations and diplomatic relations with most of the nations in the world, and to suggest that because sometime there were no boundaries between those countries is to make exactly the same argument the dictators have always done. Hitler made that argument in the time of the Anschluss, you may recall, and Gaddafi made that argument at the time that he invaded Chad, and so forth and so forth.
As an academic, when you look at the comparisons that are being drawn between Saddam Hussein and Hitler, are they legitimate comparisons?
Well, the problem with analogies is knowing what's similar, where the analogy begins and where it ends. There are certain similarities which are certainly real between Saddam Hussein and Hitler. I mean, both are men with a real proclivity for violence. I think that's clear. I wish it weren't, but I think it pretty clearly is that Saddam Hussein has, after all, under Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi government itself has become very repressive. A lot of violence has been used against the Iraqi population. There have been use of force against Iran, use of force now against Kuwait, lots of threats of the use of force against Israel, Syria. Most of his neighbors have been threatened. No, Hitler was a violent man. Saddam Hussein is a violent man, no doubt about that. I don't think Saddam Hussein is in a position to expand as far as Adolf Hitler was in a position to expand. Would he if he could? Maybe. Certainly they are both profoundly anti-Semitic. That's, I think, another valid analogy. But I don't think I'm not sure that it's very useful to press the analogy very far because the situations of Iraq and Germany are just very different.
We have, as the United States, made one of the must-dos with regard to the situation, the restoration of the rightful government of Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
That government's not a democracy, however.
That's right.
Should we be supporting governments that are not democracies?
Oh, you know, that's... I think what we're doing is opposing aggression. My own judgment really is that it's almost always a mistake for the United States to become actively involved in supporting really repressive governments. Now, I don't think the government of Kuwait was really repressive government. I don't think, by the way, that, you know, there aren't really many, if any, democracies in the Middle East except Israel. But not all the governments are as repressive as Iraq, and almost none of the governments except Syria are as expansionist as Iraq. Maybe even Syria is not as expansionist, though it's certainly an expansionist dictatorship. I think as between the government of Kuwait and the government of Iraq is much more violent and much more repressive, much more dangerous for the rest of the world. And I think that we are supporting the government of Kuwait because it was a sovereign government, which was a victim of a very bald act of aggression. That's and I think we ought to be clear that that's what we're doing, is opposing aggression and supporting world order.
You suggested earlier that we, I shouldn't use we, but the United States as its policy and the other nations involved in this have suggested, or should be, not satisfied leaving Saddam Hussein in power with the tools of aggression as a long-term objective of this maneuver. Is there a diplomatic solution that would satisfy Saddam Hussein in any sense?
I have a feeling. See, this is where I think, as a professor, I teach courses, by the way, in personality and politics for years. I've been teaching them. I think that Saddam Hussein is the kind of man who is not likely to be satisfied. That you might have, you know, we might have thought that the Iran-Iraq war and his very bad experience with the Iran-Iraq war would have satisfied or sated his appetite for adventure or expansion for a while. He thought he was going to attack Iran at a time that it was weak now. But it didn't. And he issued a lot of threats against Israel. Well, and very serious threats, I think. But then he actually moved against, as bullies do, he moved against a country too weak to defend itself against him, namely Kuwait. I don't think Saddam Hussein is going to be satisfied. That's exactly what makes him such a permanent danger to peace and order, I think, in the region, is that I think he's got insatiable appetites for power, in fact.
So what's the option?
Well, the option, I think, I mean, one could say, therefore, you know, we should try to bring down Saddam Hussein. I'm personally less interested in Saddam Hussein than I am in his capacity to make war on all of his neighbors, whether Kuwait or the Saudis or Israel or whomever. And what I would like to do is see him deprived of the instruments for massive destruction, specifically the chemical weapons and the nuclear capacity. And that's what would satisfy me, frankly. I don't think we can satisfy Saddam Hussein, though, in negotiations.
Who's left in the country if he goes?
Unless, by the way, we give him control of the Gulf, you know, and all of his resources. I think he might be satisfied, temporarily at least. That's the problem, you know. Who's left if he goes? It's. I think that all the countries of the Middle East, certainly the Gulf region, are going to find themselves over the next decades involved in processes of political modernization as well as other and social modernization. And I think that what one would have to hope for Iraq is a constitutional government which used, you know, far less force against either its population or its neighbors. I see no reason that the Iraqis can't achieve that, frankly. That Iraq has had aspirations, certainly, for constitutional government, and had some experience with constitutional monarchy, or at least a monarchy that aspired to be constitutional monarchy. That's, and I think that I don't think that the alternatives are Saddam Hussein or the Khomeiniites. I hope they're not.
Which other states in the region are ripe for change in the coming years?
Oh, probably all the states in the region, virtually, with you know, exception of Israel. I think that's and I don't mean change of regime necessarily. I think modernization. See, this is what one needs to remember about Kuwait is that modernization of a monarchy is a wholly credible, you know, it's a process through which a good many nations have gone, from monarchy, from absolute monarch or nearly absolute monarch to constitutional monarchy to progressive representation of people is a fairly well-known pathway to political modernization. I think that Morocco has followed this pathway to a considerable extent. And I believe that Kuwait could, I think Saudi Arabia can, and the Emirates, the other Emirates can, and I suspect that they will if there aren't, and Jordan, if there are not violent ruptures.
And how does the Palestinian question play into this?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that Yasser Arafat was one of the very, very few leaders in the Arab world who offered support for Saddam Hussein in his action against Kuwait, moreover. And it's also interesting that the Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians in Jordan have expressed a lot of enthusiasm for Saddam Hussein and his aggression even. So I think there's obviously some strong pro-Hussein feeling in the Palestinian, some portions at least of the Palestinian community. That's a problem. It's a problem for King Hussein. It's a problem, I think, for Israel. It's a problem for all of us.
What should the United States' long-term strategic objectives for the area, for that region, be?
Same, I think, you know, I really believe that our long-term strategic objectives should be sort of world order and democratic institution building. Frankly, I think that most of the problems in the region would be solved if there were democratic governments in the region. You know, most of the problems in the region, the political problems in the region, are a consequence of the use of force. The use of force to solve political problems. I really have deep anguish about Lebanon, for example. I ache for Lebanon and the slaughter of the Lebanese people. And I think that the Lebanese could solve their problems with each other, and they could work out their relations with Syria and with Israel, all very peaceably, if they could, and satisfactorily, I believe, satisfactorily in the long run, if the parties were willing to accept peaceable means rather than the use of force. Assad, I think, has spoiled Lebanon virtually with his military occupation, which continues till today, of large areas of Lebanon. And I think that the answer is democracy, I believe. And I think that the U.S. long-range goal should be democratic institution building for the Middle East.
And our strategic goals with regards to the oil reserve and oil supply? How does
I think our strategic goals there should, in fact, just be, world access. That's, I think that's what we want. That's our only interest in. We are not that dependent, of course, on Gulf oil. And we don't need to be as dependent as we are. That some of our friends and allies are, but we're not. And I think that it would be very much against the interests of the whole world to have a man like Saddam Hussein have a kind of stranglehold on the oil of the Gulf. But I think that access of the world is our interest and their interest.
And of Israel, the world has been urging, it seems, Israel to stay on the sidelines, and Iraq has been trying to draw them in, at least in the debate, if not the military side of it. What should Israel do in this situation?
I think Israel's doing very well. Nothing at all.
Would it be content to stay that way?
Oh, I think so. I think as long as there is no move against Jordan or King Hussein, I think Israel has made very clear in the beginning of this crisis that they regarded the survival of King Hussein and the Hashemite regime as a matter of vital concern to Israel, a vital national interest. But as long as there is no move made against that Hashemite regime, I think that Israel will remain as they are, sort of friendly observers.
As you look at the situation as it exists now, we're 3 weeks into this, I guess, is this something that's going to be solvable in a short-term deal, or is it a longer-term situation?
Well, predicting is awful, because nobody predicted this. Who would have thought that Saddam Hussein would be dumb enough to do what he did? I certainly wouldn't have predicted it. I would have thought he was too smart to do it, frankly. I don't know how to predict the end of it. I think that the United States and the United Nations forces, our allies, that coalition, will stand firm and maintain a blockade. And I think that we will, in other words, squeeze and contain. And I think that Iraq and Saddam Hussein's regime will not be able to stand that too long. But that's a fairly long-range scenario. Anytime you've got a personalist regime like Iraq, headed by one man who really finally makes all the decisions, calls all the shots, you have a very special kind of instability, though, because he could decide almost anything. And he could also be overthrown. I don't think Saddam Hussein's regime is as stable and strong as most people think it is.
Many people question the commitment of the U.S. and the international community if it is a longer-term situation. How's the stick-to-itiveness, do you think?
Well, I suspect our stick-to-itiveness is about as good as anybody else's. I think Saddam Hussein has already demonstrated in that 8-year-long war with Iran that he's prepared to impose almost any kind of hardship on the Iraqi people. But I think Americans have enough staying capacity to solve this problem, do this job.
We only have a couple of minutes left with you. You miss being in the midst of all of this?
No. As a matter of fact, I'm very glad I was not the one who had the responsibility for putting together those resolutions which would secure majority support in the United Nations. I mean, I think it was doable, all right. But it's a very major responsibility. I think that, I am not sorry that I didn't have to vote on the question of whether or not the United States should engage in a massive buildup in Saudi Arabia as compared to a small one, as compared to, a purely diplomatic solution. These are absolutely horrible, awful responsibilities. Awful in the true sense of the word, awesome responsibilities. And while I can bear those responsibilities, I don't long for them.
Do you know how you would have voted?
I don't know, but you know, there's one thing I don't know about this situation, which I wish I did. I don't feel that I really know for certain what all the intelligence was, the best intelligence was, on Saddam